now let's get right to our guest. And I have to say, I can't wait, because I can't think of anybody who has achieved more as a performing artist than this woman. In a career spanning, well, I won't tell you how many years. It's a long and august, illustrious career. Petula Clark has proven to be a master of reinvention, moving from child star to film actress to chart-topping pop icon and French chanteuse with over 68 million records sold, accomplished songwriter and stage headliner. Throughout it, there's always been a voice of crystalline beauty and purity, impeccable musicianship, and a rare combination of warmth and curiosity. Petula, how are you?
Wow, I'm fine. That was quite a build-up, Brian.
Very richly deserved, I have to say. Well, I could also have added, and one of my very favorite people anywhere.
Brian, that is so sweet. It's lovely to have this opportunity to talk to you. It's great.
Well, thank you for being our guest. I'd like to actually go right back to the beginning and some of your earliest recollections. You're very much a Welsh woman, and I know that at least part of your childhood was spent in Caerphilly. Isn't that so with your grandparents?
I'm going to have to correct you. It wasn't in Caerphilly, unfortunately, which is beautiful. More like Merthyr Tydfil, which is not quite so beautiful, but definitely South Wales, yes.
Okay.
My mother was Welsh, I mean really Welsh. She had an accent like that, you know, the real Welsh accent, which I love. And my grandmother, she spoke English, but she refused to speak it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. And she was a rather sweet, rather bossy little lady, and I adored her. And my grandfather was a coal miner. I adored him too. So I did spend quite a lot of time there, particularly during the war, Second World War, when things were getting a bit hectic in London, you know, with the bombardments and blitz and that. Yeah, I love Wales.
Were you part of that generation of evacuated children who were taken out of London?
No, we weren't evacuees. I have a sister, and we used to just go to Wales, and I absolutely loved it. That's where I first started singing, because you know, I'm sure that the Welsh are musical people, a bit like the Italians, you know.
The most musical, absolutely.
Yes. So I used to run around the mountains a bit like Sound of Music, you know, barefoot and sing, and that was the beginning for me personally.
Right. But it was a very simple life. I mean, you weren't a posh family. I mean, the conditions were pretty basic, right?
Oh, we were definitely not posh. My grandfather was a coal miner, and my grandparents lived in this house, which my sister and I, absolutely adored. It was a stone house, a terrace house, had no electricity, no running water. You had to go to the bottom of the garden, a very long garden, to get to the loo. But we absolutely loved it. For us, it was magic. You know, that's the thing about childhood, you know.
That's great. So you were singing, and I think starting off in church choirs, right?
Well, you know, in Wales, well, it wouldn't be church, it would be chapel. Careful now. Yeah. Chapel, yes. Chapel. And in our little village in Wales, there were 4 chapels and 1 church. And we never went to church. We used to go to chapel.
Right.
And yes, that's the first time I sang in public. This was an amazing experience for me. I was very tiny. I was about 6 years old. And it was a little bit scary, you know. The chapel smelt of, you know, that sort of musty, woody smell, and the music was wonderful, but very somber. Mm-hmm. And I sang, and the people loved it, and I saw their faces listening to me, and that was a revelation, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. But you actually came to national attention almost by accident. You were on the BBC, but it wasn't originally supposed to be singing, right?
No, it all took place in a theatre called the Criterion, which is in Piccadilly Circus. It's still there, and it's a very successful little theatre. And the BBC took it over because it was and still is underground.
Right.
You have to go down quite a steep flight of stairs to get to the actual auditorium. And it was full of sandbags at the time. It was like a glorified air raid shelter.
Mm-hmm.
And I went along with a few other children. The idea of the show was, it was called It's All Yours, and it was for the forces. And children could go along and send messages to their dad or their uncle or their cousin saying, we're okay, don't worry about us, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sending a message to my uncle, and during rehearsal, there was a huge air raid. I mean, the place was absolutely shaking. This is Piccadilly Circus, you know.
Right.
And most of the children were up from the country and were a bit nervous. And so the producer stood up on the stage and said, would somebody like to come up and say a piece of poetry, sing a song, you know, just to calm things down? And nobody else volunteered. So I put my hand up and said, I'll sing a song. So I got up on the stage and they put a box for me to stand on to get to the microphone, the old-fashioned BBC microphone. And I sang into it. And they heard it up in the control room. And afterwards said, we'd like that. Would you like to sing a song as well as send a message to your uncle? Yeah, yes. And that was the first time I was heard on the air, so to speak. There was an amazing reaction to it from the soldiers, and the BBC got back to us afterwards and said, we would love you to come back and sing some more. And that was sort of the beginning of a big career, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, and I think if I read correctly, you sang Mighty Like a Rose, the Ethelbert Nevin song.
I did.
Which became,
yes.
I guess, a bit of a signature during those war years. That was one of the things that I've seen some broadcast footage of you singing.
Yes.
And you were absolutely adorable. But you ended up not only doing national radio broadcasts, but also touring around the country and singing for the troops. Isn't that right?
Well, yes, you know, I became a bit of a name. You know, there was a wonderful lady who we lost recently, Dame Vera Lynn, who was the forces' sweetheart,
mm-hmm.
and I was the forces' little girl. I represented all the children who got left behind. So I became quite well known,
yeah.
And so I went off doing shows. I used to sing for the troops. We did a lot of troop shows. I say we, because there was another little girl who was also doing these things. Her name was, and still is, Julie Andrews. And we used to go off on troop trains and sleep in the luggage racks because it was dark. We weren't allowed to have the lights on in the train. It was a blackout. And we would get off the train, not knowing where we were, and go to some camp. Sometimes it would be Canadians, very
mm-hmm.
often. Canadians, Americans, Brits, Free French, Poles. We'd sing, not together. Julie was very rather prim and had this beautiful high sort of soprano voice, and I was a bit more
more in the middle,
a bit more swing, you know,
yeah.
and comedy and that kind of thing.
Oh, that's amazing. I read that as part of those tours, you ended up singing for Churchill and King George and Field Marshal Montgomery. Did that actually happen?
Yes, I'm not quite sure who it was in the audience. Certainly Mountbatten was in the audience. That was at the Albert Hall,
mm-hmm.
or RA, as we call it, the Royal Albert Hall. And I remember the first time I sang there, I had absolutely no nerves whatsoever. I think I was reading a comic before I went on stage. And yes, and somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, Petula, you're on. And so I dog-eared my comic, went on, and so they say, kind of pulled the place down and went back to my comic as if nothing had happened.
That's incredible. I mean, for those few in our audience who have never been to the Royal Albert Hall, that's 5,000 seats. That is no small space. And
it's a wonderful space. It was built not by her personally, but by Queen Victoria for her beloved Prince Albert. It's an amazing place.
Well, I can just visualize you as this tiny little speck on the stage, belting it out. It must have been incredible. So what you sort of alluded, but what kind of music were you singing mostly? I mean, were they, wartime, keep the home fires burning songs, or sacred music, or pop, swing influenced? What was, was it sort of an Andrew Sisters vibe?
Sort of. I sang a little bit of swing, like G.I. Jive and stuff like that. And then I would do Ave Maria, would you believe? I just sang, half the time I didn't realize what I was singing was important. Certainly I didn't realize it was important. I just liked singing, and that was it.
Right. And your dad was sort of guiding you along this path at this stage. And I take it that he was both very protective, but also really got a charge out of seeing your success.
Well, my dad was a very handsome man. He used to get mistaken for Errol Flynn quite a lot. I don't know if you remember Errol Flynn.
Oh, yes.
The starter. And in fact, once he got bitten on the leg by an Errol Flynn fan. And he was really quite proud of that. No, but my father had always wanted to be an actor and was never allowed to do it. His parents thought it was, acting. It's just, So he was a bit frustrated. So when he realized that he had a daughter who had some talent, he's encouraged me, and he became my manager. But, let's face it, we had no influence. We didn't know anything about show business as such. Right. But, and he was in the army too. So it was a bit sort of, higgledy-piggledy.
Yeah. It must have been both an exciting but also a difficult childhood. I mean, you weren't spending a lot of time with other children, and keeping up on your book learning must have been a bit of a challenge as well. How often were you out, singing for the troops or on the radio or in halls? How much of your average week during that time would have been spent performing?
Well, it was the war, and for just about everybody, life was totally different. And kids, personally, I went to school, but only now and then, because I was working. And then when I did go to school, a lot of time was spent in the school air raid shelter.
Yeah.
And there we would be, with all the sandbags and, oil lamps and stuff like that. And it was very difficult for the teachers to carry on teaching us. So we would sing, and I would tell the kids stories, and life was very different. And we sort of took it for granted. That's just the way it was.
But along with this, I mean, you are, by the end of the war, you're a full-blown child star. I've even seen that there was an Our Pet comic strip at one point, which is amazing. I mean, that's like ultimate immortality for most young people today, to be featured in their own comic strip.
Yes. I was in 2 comics. I was in Radio Fun. I think it was Petula, or Pet, the Merry Mimic, because I used to do impersonations. And then there was film Fun too. So I suppose that was quite an honor, really.
Okay, well, it is. I mean, how many of us can say that? As we get to sort of the end of the war years, I'd like to sort of take a little sidetrack, because you may remember that when we first arranged this, we have a regular feature in our podcast called Tell Me a Story. And in that, we invite our guests to tell us any story a few minutes long. It can be from their lives, it can be from the lives of someone they know, or it can be made up. It could be something that you told your children when they were growing up. So would you like to tell us a story, Petula?
Well, I don't know if it's exactly a story. It's something that I remember with great affection. I was making a film in Hollywood called Finian's Rainbow with Fred Astaire. I was playing his daughter, and it was directed by Francis Ford Coppola, a very young, crazy, brilliant director. We were shooting, the film was mostly shot on the back lot of Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank.
Mm-hmm.
And to have lunch, I would have to ride my bike back to the studio, to the commissary, the canteen. And there I was riding my bike, still in my costume, and very hot weather, and it was. And I saw these big doors open of the sound stage, and out comes Ella Fitzgerald.
Oh, wow.
And what did I do? I fell off my bike, of course. And there I was in a heap on the floor with my skirt tangled up in the wheels. And she had rather bad eyesight, and she had come out of this dark studio into the bright light, and she was sort of like this. And I looked up at her, and I said, "My God, you're Ella Fitzgerald." And she looked down at me and she said, "Yeah, and you're Petula Clark." And there we were, staring at each other. And bless her heart, she picked me up, untangled me from my bike, and took me in her arms and gave me a hug. And she said, "Oh, I love you so much. I love the way you sing." And I said, what? You know, so I'm going, "Ella Fitzgerald." And we had this wonderful, I suppose, about 10 minutes just standing there chatting. And eventually I got back on my bike, off to the canteen. And as I was leaving, she waved to me and she said, "Hey, Petula, write me a song." I said, "Did she actually say that?" And, I know it's not much of a story, but
that's a great story.
Remained in my, and I got to know her little by little in different meetings we had all over the place. And we've never forgot our first meeting.
Well, if you don't mind my saying so, that's even better than having your own comic strip.
It's pretty good.
Yeah. Well, you've sort of foreshadowed where I was going next, which is you moving into the film world. And that happened just around the end of the war, I think. And you ended up under contract to the Rank Organization. Now, that was really interesting because I don't think most North Americans have seen too many of the films that you made in the UK, but they were quite successful. And I Know Where I'm Going is certainly a very, very beloved film. But you became also a Hugget. Now, tell me, what is a Hugget?
Well, Hugget is the name of the family, the Hugget family. And I was the youngest Hugget. And it was things that happened to us. We made 3 movies in a rather grotty little studio in Islington. It was an amazing thing because we made 3 movies, one after another, and became really like a real family. And they were, as you say, enormously successful. But I was in a lot of movies. I was under contract to Rank as an actress, not as a singer, because we weren't making musicals anyway. They were too expensive for us. But some of them were really bad, let's face it, they were bad. And some of them weren't bad at all. I Know Where I'm Going has become a classic. And I was in a film with Alec Guinness, which was called The Card in English. Maybe it was something else on your side of the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. So, I was a contract artist. So they would call up my house and say, "We want Petula to be here on Monday morning." And I would arrive and I would know nothing about what the film was about. I hadn't seen a script. I was a working actress.
Now, I was reading about one of those films because it was a big budget film and it was supposed to be a spectacular. They made it in Technicolor, which is very expensive, and it ended up being a huge flop. It was London Town. Now, yes. I don't know a lot about that film, but if you could tell me how you ended up, because you had a pretty big role in that, right?
Yes, but I didn't sing in it. I played Sid Field's daughter. Now, Sid Field, I don't know if your listeners or viewers would know Sid Field. He was a huge star in England, a comedian, very funny man, very loved. There was a girl in it. It was her first movie, Kay Kendall.
Yeah, for sure.
And Tessie O'Shea. She was a rather large lady who played the ukulele.
Two-ton Tessie.
Two-ton Tessie. There you go.
Yes.
You remember. Anyway, there we were. And as you say, it was a big budget movie directed by an American, and it was really not very good. I don't know why, but I don't know, these things go wrong, you know. Yeah, but you're right. Thank you for reminding me.
Well, you know, this is a theme that, you know, you have amazing successes, but they can't all be. And sometimes the things that really look like they're going to be big end up being the real disappointments. But you know, one of the things that I think is really kind of a hallmark of your career is, you know, pick yourself up, move on, and find something new that can be even more successful going forward. So you're a working actress, but you're also at this point recording because your dad helped set up a record label for you, Polygon. And
that's true. Yes. Yes, but you know, it wasn't a big thing, you know, and we used to go into the studio and record. I made a few records with the Dr. Bernardo's Children, and you know, I found recording a rather strange experience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's no audience. You know, you're stuck with a microphone in a studio, and then quite often the musicians aren't there. They've been pre-recorded, and I found it not always easy. It took me a long time to become comfortable with the recording studio, and that happened as the years went by.
Yeah, but at the same time, you needed to make, and I can only imagine a pretty painful transition from being, you know, Britain's sweetheart and a child star to really, I mean, you were a young Huggett, still at what, 18 or 17 years old, and you're becoming a young woman. That has to have been very, very challenging.
Well, yes, you know, I was under contract to the Rank organization, and for them, I was worth more as a child than as an adolescent. You know, adolescence today, that's it, you know. But in those days, adolescence was something that was, you know, you had to hide away. You know, they used to call it the awkward age.
Yeah.
And so they kept me young. They used to bind in my bosom, for instance, which you know, I wasn't keen on at all.
Yeah,
and
sure.
You know, and wear little sort of bunches and bobby socks, and that was not an easy time for me.
Yeah.
To be honest.
I'm assuming that they discouraged you from having boyfriends or at least being seen with them in public.
Oh, yeah, nothing like that, you know.
Yeah.
And I remember singing on television. Eventually I had my own television show, and it was a very intimate kind of show, you know, no big orchestra or anything like that. And I used to love singing. I adored Peggy Lee. She was my idol.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to sing this song because I thought it was so beautiful. And I sang it. I can't remember what it's called now. Was it When the World Was Young? No, it wasn't that one. Anyway, and I got a huge reaction from the audience saying, "This is disgusting, our little pet singing this kind of song, you know, it's sort of sexual something or other." I didn't know what they were talking about, of course. So I was not allowed to sing anything that had any kind of romantic something, you know.
Right.
And I was locked in from many points of view. It was not an easy time for me.
Right. And as you...
But I'm over it now.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. Well, I have to say, you know, being younger than your years, you seem to have gotten the trick of. So you've got that on the rebound, because you're pretty amazing, I have to say. Of course, your father's your manager, and he's seeing the success. I mean, was he understanding about your need to make this change and actually gain some acceptance as, an adolescent and a young adult, or was that a friction point?
It became very difficult because, I adored my father. My father was, there's been talk of him being abusive and all that kind of, he's absolute rubbish. I loved him, and yes, he was strict with me, but I think he was right to be strict with me. We were all our kids of that generation were living fairly strict lives anyway. But, I was in show business, and my father didn't want me to be a spoiled showbiz brat,
Right.
And so, it was tough. And I was going through adolescence coming up, and I was not very happy. And eventually, I didn't know half the time if I was talking to my dad or to my manager.
Right.
And it became very complicated. And eventually, we had to part company.
Oh, and that must have been unbelievably painful.
For him and for me.
Yeah. But was there a moment, so to speak, a kind of a professional coming out party where you sort of staked your territory as a young adult performer? There was one film in which you had a strictly dramatic role, as I recall, in reading over your filmography, that was sort of the opposite direction from the Huggets. And I can't remember right now the name of that film, but you ultimately did emerge as a young adult pop singer and actress.
It was a tricky journey, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But, I was inspired by my love of singing, of music, of acting. For me, acting and singing was and still is actually they're sort of the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's almost the same muscle, if you like. I loved what I was doing when I was doing it. My private life was difficult, but the actual business of getting up on stage and doing what I love, that made up for it.
And it's great that was there for you. I've listened to a lot of your records from that period in your life, and it's very interesting for a British young female pop singer. It seems that there was kind of a mixture of novelty songs like The Shoemaker and some fairly light romantic ballad types, some things with a little bit of a doo-wop feel, sort of imported from the States, maybe a little bit of skiffle emerging, but pretty light. But around this time, you also become introduced to France and the French audience. How did that come about? Because that was quite a different musical climate that you got introduced to.
Yes, well, that was kind of strange the way that happened. Well, I started getting these phone calls from Paris with this man who was saying, "Oh, Petula, you have to come to Paris." I said, "What? Yes, you have to come to Paris. This woman is copying your records in French." And I said, "Well, okay, what do I care,
Uh-huh.
No, you have to come." I said, "No, I really don't want. I don't want to go to Paris. Thank you for asking me. Goodbye." They called back. "Oh, you have to come. Oh. But then he started saying, "It's for Europe numéro 1." What is that? Europe number 1. What is that? And of course, it was the radio station of the time. It was like the most hip kind of radio station. "And you would be singing at the Olympia." I said, "What, the Olympia? What's that?" We've got an Olympia in London. It's a big sort of exhibition hall. No. It is a theater. It's very important. You must come." Well, this went on for a while with me saying no. And eventually I said, "Okay, I'll come. He couldn't speak very good English, and I could speak no French whatsoever. So off I go to Paris with the most awful cold,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of cold, runny nose and the whole thing. So I arrived in Paris. The show was the next day. They took me to a doctor, and I was sitting in the waiting room, and there was this sort of glass case with all these old-fashioned medical instruments, sort of nasty-looking things.
Scary.
And I thought, this is a bit strange. And then the door opens, out comes the doctor, and it's Napoleon. I mean, the hair, the physique, the whole thing. Oh, wait a minute, is this some kind of revenge going on here? Whoa.
You thought you'd met your Waterloo.
Anyway, Dr. Fouquet, his name was, and he examined me very sort of like this, nothing very technical. And then he gave me a prescription. I was driven to a pharmacy, and I get the thing, and I look at this thing. I said, well, what are these? Suppositoires.
Oh, no, no.
Depositories? I said, wait a minute, I've got a sore throat. He said, are we? I said, well, what would I do with these? He said, okay. I thought, well, this is getting more weird every minute. Do you know what? It worked. Amazing. The next day, I was able to sing. Not too well, but I did the show. And the Olympia is fantastic theatre, of course, yes. Very prestigious. And I couldn't even say bonsoir or merci. I was petrified by the French language. Yep. And I sang 3 songs in English and pulled the place down. The place went crazy. So, oh, that's nice, well, I've done that. The next morning, I went to the office of the man who had been asking me to come to Paris, that one. He was the boss of the record company. And he said, oh, you saw last night, you had a triomphe. It was marvelous. The people love you. I said, I want to go home. I want my hot water bottle and go home. And he said, no. He said, you must record in French. I said, I record in French, I want to go home. I've got a boyfriend at home. I've got my sports car. I want to go home to my nice, cozy flat. No, you must do it, Anyway, in the middle of all this, the light over his desk goes out. Mm-hmm. And we're in total darkness, no windows, of course. And he says something in French, and this person comes in, stands on the desk, and changes the light bulb. And it comes on, and I look up at this bloke, and he is gorgeous. Uh-huh. And I say to the boss, who's that? And he said, oh, that is Claude Wolf. And if you make your record and you come to Paris, he will be taking care of you and showing you around the stage. I said, oh, okay. And what do you know? 3 weeks later, I was back in Paris with my first French record, which was very bad. But the point was that I wanted to get back to Paris to spend some time with this guy,
Right.
And 18 months later, we got married.
One thing led to another, as they say, and 3 children. Yes. And,
yes.
One could say epic love story. But this is actually really interesting from a musical as well as a personal point of view. First of all, obviously, by this time, I think it's safe to say you'd completely shed the child star persona, and, you're an adult, and certainly the French really only knew you as a young adult performer, so that wasn't part of your baggage. But also, the French musical scene was a lot different. I mean, you've got people like Piaf and Jacques Brel, and Serge Gainsbourg and Sacha Distel. I mean, popular music, pop songs are really treated as a kind of a high art. And you're plunged right into the middle of that. And did that kind of rub off on your feeling for what you were doing when you went back across the channel and were selecting material for your English recordings and performances as well?
Yes, life is a strange journey. I wasn't expecting to find myself living in Paris and singing in French and mixing with Piaf and Brel. First of all, half of them I had never even heard of. But yes, it was rubbing off on me. I arrived in Paris. They knew nothing about Little Pet, and the Huggets.
Yeah.
Not only did they not know, they just didn't care, They liked me the way I was. And that was a rather nice feeling. I really needed that. I think I really needed that. And so there I was, living in Paris, having a problem with the language, but picking it up slowly and learning things that I didn't even realize that I was learning. It was like assimilation.
Right.
And, I went to see Piaf at the Olympia Theatre, and I saw her. She walked out on stage in her funny little black dress, which was not chic at all. And she could hardly walk. She had very bad arthritis. And I remember thinking to myself in my very British way, oh, I don't think I'm going to like this,
Mm-hmm.
And she started to sing. And it happened, and I didn't quite know what had happened, but it was something to do with her giving not just this amazing voice, which was foreign to me, but she was giving her whole being on stage. And I had never seen that before.
Right.
I had grown up in another thing, come on stage, keep it nice and cheerful and happy, and nice bright dress, finish with a big ballad and that.
Yeah.
Very, very different in France. And of course, I was on tour with Jacques Brel, and I had the education, if you like, of being able to watch him every night from the wings. And I wasn't turning into a realist singer,
Mm-hmm.
but something was rubbing off on me. I began to realize that performing was not just about getting the notes out, but about somehow reaching into myself and letting it come out in my performance.
And they accepted you as a peer. Brel wrote a song for you. You were working regularly with Sacha Distel and with Serge Gainsbourg as well, right? And that must have been quite an exhilarating experience because, of course, we have the persona of, these people with their tormented lives and all of their existential angst being poured into their songs. Back across the channel, you have a #1 hit with Shoemaker, and that must have seemed like you were living really in two different musical worlds.
Yes, Sacha was a great friend. Sacha wasn't a tortured, he wasn't Jacques Brel,
Right.
You don't have to be tortured to be good at what you do, there are other ways of touching people. You don't have to be this full of angst. Yeah. But what I was learning is that whatever you have inside you, you give it. That is it. That is what you have to do.
Right.
Otherwise, what's the point? Singing is easy. I have a natural voice. I've never had any lessons. So singing is something I just do. What makes it interesting for me is what happens when a song is touching me and I'm able to transmit that to an audience.
Right. I have to say, and I've read that this is a song that you don't particularly care for, but it was a huge hit, Sailor. And I think that really does show some of that influence starting to reach into your English work at that time.
Yes, you're right. Sailor was a big hit, of course, and it was a big hit in France too. It's some songs, it's a fascinating thing about songs. Some songs I get a lot of songs sent to me and I listen to them and think, oh, that's great. I'd love to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I never say that could be a hit because I know by now that we never know
Right.
what's going to be a hit. But sometimes a song you don't especially like, and you do it, and you think, oh, yeah. And there it is.
Yeah.
There it is. You know, I didn't especially like This Is My Song. And there it is. I didn't especially like My Love, you know, the da da dee 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 da 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 da.
Yeah.
No, I didn't like it. I didn't like it from the moment I recorded it. And actually, I still don't like it. I mean, no, it's careful. No, I do sing it.
Yes.
You know, I've learned to live with it. Let's put it that way.
Right. But you can't argue with what, you know, a hit song does for you. So, you know, I mean, at a certain point, I guess you bow to the wisdom of the audience and say, if it worked for you, you know, I can put up with it.
Well, you know, I don't make the hits. I just sing the songs. It's an audience that makes the hit.
Right.
You
exactly.
know, it's a very strange, magical thing that happens. I mean, you know, when Downtown happened, I mean, we knew it was a good song and it was a pretty good record, but we had no idea that it was going to be that, you know.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to that, but before we sort of move off of your work on the continent, by the end of the 50s, you're also recording in Italian and German and really experiencing success all across the continent, obviously having to get used to being a multilingual singer, which I can imagine, because when you went across to sing at the Olympia, had you even been out of the UK at that point in your life? Was that your first step outside of Britain?
I had sung in Scandinavia a little bit and Holland, but of course they're very Englishy speaking people. I mean, France, particularly back then, France was totally different to anywhere else, and very, very French. Well, they sort of put up with the Beatles, kind of, but you know, you had to sing in French. I sang some Beatles songs in French, you know, so it was very like that. I mean, it's totally different now. I mean, it's opened up, like the whole world has opened up. But at that time, it was really French.
Yeah. And is it about this time that you start writing your own songs as well?
Well, I wrote in France, for instance, I wrote a song that was a big hit for me called Que fais-tu la Petula, which had a lyric by a wonderful lyric writer called Pierre Delanoy, who wrote the most magnificent lyrics for many, many great stars. And I adored him, and we got on very well. And we wrote this song together. I wrote the music, and we wrote quite a few things together. And I started enjoying that, you know, because I've always liked playing. I play piano by ear, incidentally. Here I am on the Glenn Gould.
Oh no!
But you know, I love the piano, so I write on the piano. But it was actually Tony Hatch who encouraged me to write. We were doing an album. You know, he was writing a lot for me at one point, and he was writing sort of 12 songs. And he called me one day and he said, "I can't find the 13th song. I haven't got it. I haven't got it." He said, "Why don't you write something, write a melody, and we'll take care of the lyric." I said, "Oh, okay." And I wrote a song called You're the One. And I wrote the melody, and he and Jackie Trent, I think, wrote the lyric. And I thought, well, this is kind of good. And then, you know, a group called the Vogues recorded it and had a hit with it. I thought, oh, wow, you know, maybe I can do this. And
absolutely. and you've actually got a pretty decent sized catalog that you've accumulated over the years. So that's really, that's
Brian,
really
I've become very happy writing. I enjoy it almost as much as singing. But I'm not what I call a professional songwriter. You know, there are people sort of like Paul Anka, you know, you call up Paul and say, "I want a song," and then he just does it, you know. No, it has to come to me, and if it doesn't come, it doesn't come, you know. And But when it does, it comes very quickly and with all the harmonies and everything.
Yep.
So it's a great joy for me to write.
Mm-hmm. So this is actually a very interesting point in your career, because you have huge success in the UK. You have equally huge, maybe even more so, in France and increasingly on the continent, but you're little known in the US. And then, to mention a name you've already mentioned, Tony Hatch comes along, Downtown happens, and suddenly, not even an equal, but a greater level of success happens instantaneously for you in the US and all over the world. How did your collaboration with Tony get started? Was that, you were introduced at a party, or, you were thrown together by a record label, or how did that begin?
Well, my record label in England was called Pye, P-Y-E,
Mm-hmm.
and I was doing all my French recording, Italian and German, and some Spanish recordings. Everything was being done in London. Everybody was recording in London, including many French performers. London was the place to record. It was just better.
Yeah.
And better, had more feel and better arrangers. It's changed a lot since then, but at the time, everything was in London. And I used to do all my recordings there. And there was this young man, Tony Hatch, who was a kind of junior producer who would put my sessions together, and he would make sure that the orchestrations were right, get the right musicians, book the studio, the engineer and all of that, everything, take care of that side of it. And I liked him, we got on really well. And he came over to France, to Paris, to talk about the next recording in French. He said, you really should be recording again in English. I said, well, I haven't got time to do that. I'm off doing this and that. I was extremely busy at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Had 2 small children at the time. And I said, but if I find the right song, yes, of course. He said, well, I've started writing this song. I said, yes. I said, have you finished it? He said, not quite. I said, well, listen, it's tea time. I'm going to make some tea. I'll go in the kitchen. Why don't you play it on my piano? And he played Downtown.
Mm-hmm.
And I came back with the tea and I said, that's not bad. Not bad. I said, if you can write a lyric up to the standard of the music, we've got a song and I want to do it. So that was it. And we went into the studio, I think 2 weeks later. I think we did 3 takes. I'm not quite sure, but it was, live.
Yep.
I tell you, the first time I heard the orchestra playing Downtown, I couldn't wait to get up to the microphone and sing it. It was so thrilling. And that was it. And it became a hit in England. I don't think it made #1. I think we were kept out by the Righteous Brothers, which isn't bad.
Yeah.
And then somebody came over from Warner Brothers Studios, Warner Brothers Records. Joe Smith came over and he heard it and he said, I want that. And he took it back with him to Warner Brothers and it was released and it was #1 in no time at all, and right. Stayed #1 for a long time.
I read somewhere that you found out that it had become that kind of explosive hit while you were performing in Montreal. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Because of your French career, you were really embraced by the Quebecois audiences. So, but that must have been a pleasant surprise, but also, I think about Downtown and the songs that followed, it was really kind of a perfect alignment of, the song, the singer. I mean, you were absolutely the perfect embodiment of that song, but also the moment, because, it's just at the leading edge of the so-called British invasion. It hits early-ish in 1964, I think. So that's a little before the Beatles go on Ed Sullivan, if I have my timing right. And it's also an interesting moment because, I think for a lot of, let's say, not teenage audiences, they found, the Beatles a little alarming and threatening, but you
About the
were,
Stones. They were
yeah, and the
really
Stones.
alarming.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. But you managed to be both a voice for adolescents and to capture a lot of what they were feeling, but also in a way be non-threatening to their parents. And I think that you managed to develop a fan base that really encompassed both at the same time. So you were both, she gets inside my deepest feelings for the young people, but yeah, she makes us feel comfortable and we like her tunes for their parents. And that's kind of a magical combination, not easy to get.
Yes, you're right. Yes. So much is about timing, of course. And
Yeah,
the Beatles had already made it in the States, and they had opened the gates to a lot of British performers, a lot of the other groups who came over, and the Stones, and including me. I don't think I would have got airplay before the Beatles.
yeah.
They just opened everything up. And of course, I was the sort of reassuring face of pop music at the time. I was a
Yeah.
nice lady, and I wasn't being rude to everybody.
Right. You
Yeah,
wore enough
but
clothes. Nothing terribly, revealing or low cut, and yet very, very lovely.
thank you.
Well, it's true. Anyway, you went on and had 13 hits, I think, with Tony Hatch, and eventually, when he was working with his wife Jackie Trent. So that's a pretty amazing string of successes.
Yes,
But again, sort of that double pronged aspect of your career, you also become a real hit on American television, largely in a variety show context. This is really kind of a golden age of TV variety shows
yeah.
in America. That's gone now completely. But you were on Ed Sullivan, I think it was 12 times, and Andy Williams, Dean Martin, Red Skelton, Shindig for younger audiences. You were on The Tonight Show with
Carol Burnett.
Carol Burnett, right? The Smothers Brothers, I think that one.
Yes,
And you sang at the 43rd Academy Awards. So, in a way, there's a kind of an interesting fusion where you can be doing, the sort of the leading edge pop material, but you can also be doing things from the American Songbook and romantic ballads and, music from Broadway, and it all kind of fits. So, it's interesting that it's a career that at that stage is combining the best of every possible world, and the audiences in the States are absolutely eating it up. It's great. And yet, when you come out with a pop hit, like, Don't Sleep in the Subway or Who Am I, it's totally accepted as, leading edge pop material, very much of the now. That's kind of a neat trick.
you've been doing your homework, Brian.
Well, I mean, we have to be prepared, but I think it really is interesting to see how you were able to kind of straddle those different milieus
Yes,
and be really well accepted in all of them at a time when other people in pop and rock music are really sort of splitting off their audiences, and we're
yes,
doing stadium rock concerts, and
yes.
we're for this group of people. And as the protest movement and the peace movement start to grow, so that's really interesting. But you did manage almost inadvertently to touch into one of the politically charged moments of the time, and that's when you had your TV special, and you chose as your guest Harry Belafonte. And so, first of all, had you been aware of him? He was the main guest on that special. It was you and Harry Belafonte for the show, not like 8 or 10 guests.
Well, I had admired Harry Belafonte for many years. I adored him. And when was it NBC asked me because it was my special. They said, well, who would you like as your guest? I said, Harry Belafonte, not thinking for one moment that he would accept, but he did. And I was thrilled, obviously. And so I arrive in California, and we start rehearsing, and we hit it off right from the start. I liked him, he liked me. We had the same feeling about things. We didn't talk about politics, and any of that stuff. We were just, it was obvious the way we felt about life in general.
Right.
Things in general, let's put it that way. And we had a duet to do. And we chose this song, which I had co-written, called Path of Glory. And he loved the song. And so
it's an anti-war song.
It's an anti-war song, yes. Yeah, it is. And we rehearsed it, and we were always very moved every time we sang it. It somehow touched us. And so we came to taping day, going in the studio and the whole thing. And the sponsor was up in his box, and anyway, we do the song. And during the song, I was moved again, and I put my hand on his, and we sort of finished the song. And then, the lights went down, and we did our first take. And then the producer, Steve Binder, who was great, incidentally, he produced the great Elvis Presley special. And he called down, he said, hey, Petula and Harry, that was really nice, but we think we're going to do it a different way. Oh, yeah. I tell you what, Harry, you go over there, Petula, you stay where you are, and we'll do one of those cross-fading things, those sort of artistic. I said, yes. He said, you'll see, it's going to be beautiful. I thought, well, this is funny. This is not the way we rehearsed it. Anyway, we did it. I think maybe we did 2 takes like that, and all the lights went out in the studio. I said, what is going on here? Harriet walks out of the studio, and then Claude, my husband, who was the sort of executive producer, and our lawyer, a wonderful man called Pete Pryor, comes down too, take me by the hand, lead me out of the studio. I said, what's going on? We're leaving the studio. We go downstairs. I've never been downstairs. And said, what's going on here? And downstairs is this area where all the tapes, everything that's being recorded upstairs in the studio, come down here. And there's this guy who's eating a sandwich, watching things coming around and making sure that everything is okay.
Right.
My lawyer said, this is Petula Clark, I'm her lawyer, this is the executive producer, and I'm giving you an order to erase all the takes except this one. And the guy said, I can't do that. We always have to keep at least one over just in case something goes wrong with the original. He said, no. Peter says, no, this is an order. You erase them and you just keep that one. Well, this poor guy, he didn't know what to do. So anyway, we watched him press the button, erase the other takes, and the one that went out was the one where I touched Harry's arm. Now, why was this all happening? It's because the sponsor up in saw my little white hand on this black man's arm, and he said, no, that's not on.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was Chrysler. That was Chrysler.
Yeah. And that was it. We had decided that was the one, that was the way it had to be. No one's going to tell us how to do something artistically. Finished. And of course, I had no idea that this was a political statement. For me, it was an artistic statement, but of course it turned into a political statement, and I was proud of it. And the Harry has never forgotten it, and a lot of people hadn't.
Well, and it aired literally within a couple of weeks of the assassination of Martin Luther King, so it was a very, very fraught moment. But you also chose that take because it was the best take. It was musically and emotionally the one that you wanted, and And in a way, as we feel these reverberations echoing back today, it must feel, like we've made so much progress, but have we made enough progress? It's it's mind blowing that people should worry about such a thing. My mom was a Brit. She grew up during the Blitz too, and African American troops were, the young people of her generation thought it was unbelievable the way, these were servicemen who were serving their country, potentially going to die, and still being treated abysmally, and they simply couldn't understand it. And I imagine that was very much the way you approached it too.
But I had grown up, as you say, like your mum in England. We hardly saw any black people, and I had admired all the great musicians and actors of color, if you like. To me, one of the reasons why I love being in show business is that there are no barriers of language or
Right.
color or religion. That's part of why I love it so much. So it was a bit of a mystery to me, this whole hoo-ha about touching Harry's arm,
So strange. So
yeah.
So awful, but also, as it happens, it did end up becoming a statement, and a positive one. So, good on that, even if it happened by happenstance. But this is also around the time, and you've already alluded to it, that you appear in two of the very last sort of echoes of the great Hollywood musical tradition. You appeared in Finian's Rainbow and Goodbye, Mr. Chips. And as you mentioned, Finian's Rainbow, you're with Fred Astaire. That must have been a remarkable experience. He was getting on by that time, but
Yes.
There's a real chemistry between the two of you in the film. What was that experience like, specifically working with him?
Well, from the moment we met, it was great. As you say, there was chemistry. I don't know what you call that, but we liked each other. I was playing his daughter. We laughed. We laughed so much. I mean, we were supposed to be Irish, and then of course the leprechaun was supposed to be Irish.
Yep.
Came in from London, talked like that. He was a Cockney.
Yeah, exactly. That was Tommy Steele. Yes.
Tommy Steele. So his accent was a bit iffy. Fred seemed to slip into Scottish from time to time. And I could never figure out if I was South or North Ireland. It was somewhere in there, I did my best, let's put it that way. But we laughed all the time. And of course we had Francis Ford Coppola directing us. Mm. And he was the new kid on the block. And he had George Lucas with him, who was his assistant. And they were both unknown.
Yeah.
And they were a bit mad, let's put it that way.
Yes.
And of course, so you had this two different schools of making movies, which was Fred Astaire.
Yeah.
Absolutely, comme il faut, it's perfect. And Francis, who just wanted to make, a real movie,
Yeah.
So we had moments where I thought that I would collapse with laughter. And we sang all the time. Fred and I, we sang together. And Francis too, of course.
Yes.
So making that movie, of course, it was a mixture of this whimsical, silly story about these father and daughter coming from Ireland to find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Yeah. And of course, the racial story going on as well. So it's a difficult story to tell.
Yes.
I don't know if we succeeded, but we had an awful lot of fun doing it.
Well, it's a film with really great moments, and you do sense that a little bit of tension between sort of this emerging style, Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas. Whatever became of them, did they ever? Anyway, and it also kind of reminds me of of one of Fred Astaire's earlier musicals, The Bandwagon, where he is basically an old-time song and dance man who runs, headlong into a boy genius of the theater. I think was probably a little modeled after Olivier, and feels himself like a fish out of water. So,
but, Fred was. I mean, he was aware of his age, and he wanted to be fantastic, and he worked harder than anybody else on that movie. He used to spend his weekends in the studio, sleeping in his dressing room and working with his choreographer. He was a perfectionist, and he was not happy about not quite making it. I adored him,
and he earned the respect of the Young Turks in that. I'm sure. How could one not? Then on to Goodbye, Mr. Chips, and you're opposite Peter O'Toole in the most un-Lawrence of Arabia-ish role imaginable, a schoolmaster. And that is also a film that has some really, really lovely moments, but, there is also this sense that, the era is passing for the big musicals. Did you have that sense? I mean, certainly these were big budget films. There were a lot of resources poured into them and a lot of great talent.
Well, I think there were tensions about this from the start. I mean, Goodbye, Mr. Chips had been a wonderful movie before. I think it was Greer Garson
and Robert Donat.
Which was wonderful. And the idea of doing it again as a musical was a bit odd, I suppose. They asked me to do it after they had seen the rushes from Finian's Rainbow, and MGM wanted me to do it, and Peter was very much for it. The music was a bit of a problem. They asked several people to maybe do some new songs, and it was Leslie Bricusse who eventually did it. I knew Leslie very well, so I think he did some beautiful stuff. And of course it was John Williams doing the orchestrations, who was not yet John Williams.
Right.
But working with him was an amazing experience. We recorded the music in the Wembley studios in London with this huge orchestra, and he was divine even then. I absolutely adored John. It was not an easy movie to make, because there was always the ghost of this wonderful original production that was around us. And I think there were some beautiful moments in it, but it was perhaps not perfect.
Right. But you got to co-star with Peter O'Toole, so that must have been a bit of an experience.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
I adored Peter. He was very, very funny, very Irish, and liked to drink a drop,
One has heard that, yes.
Yes. I remember when we were doing makeup tests, we were in Dublin, and I would go out to eat with Peter, and the evening would finish up with like about a dozen people who came out to see Peter, Peter's and of course it would be like, and I would be just as tiddly as everybody else, because there was no way around it, But I adored him. He was a generous actor. I don't know if you understand what I mean by that. He was kind, and I adored Peter.
Not given to upstaging, letting you have your moments. And
that's right.
And I think, in many ways, because he was so strikingly good looking and, cut such a dashing figure starting off with Lawrence, sometimes a little underrated as a really, really fine actor.
Oh, yes. I saw him on stage. I had never seen Peter in the theatre. And this was after Goodbye, Mr. Chips. And he was unbelievable on stage. There was something different about him on stage. Of course, he was very tall and gangly,
Yeah.
And he seemed to be all over the stage. He was fantastic. And I went back to see him afterwards. And we sat together face to face in his dressing room, just looking at each other, and tears coming down. Both of us in tears, just looking at each other.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. Now,
Yeah.
around the same time, you're also continuing to record many, many albums. And what really impresses me is how you're also exploring different styles, with albums like Memphis and Blue Lady, the album you did in Nashville.
Yeah.
Didn't get released right away, right? It took its time getting out in front of the public.
I don't know what happened to that, Brian. It was, I think we made it in Nashville, and there were some pretty good things on it, but I think there was a funny thing going on with the record company at the time. So, there are all kinds of weird things that go on with record companies, and things get lost in the shuffle.
It didn't actually appear until 1995, which is a good long wait. I guess it's that old, we will sell no wine before its time, and I guess it took its time maturing. Now, along around this time as well, you were performing in Montreal, and you had an unexpected experience with a bit of pushback from the audience. You found yourself in La Reine Elisabeth Hotel, seeking a little comfort from John and Yoko.
Yeah, I had the first time I sang in Montreal was at a French performer, and I sang entirely in French at a theatre called the Comédie Canadienne. That was great. And then just a few years later, I suppose it must have been, I had all these big hits, Downtown and etc., a whole load of string of hits. And I was asked to go back to Montreal, this time to sing at the Place des Arts, which is, big theatre. And so I thought, oh, that's great. Montreal, bilingual.
Yeah.
I can do a bilingual show. French hits, the English hits. Nice, Wrong. I mean, it was like open war in the theatre. When I sang in French, the English were saying, oh, and when I sang in English, en français, it was war.
Yeah.
And I was so miserable. I was really heartbroken at the whole thing. I thought, what is this? I'm a singer. What's going on here? So I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to talk to. Everyone was saying, oh, that's all right, don't worry about it. And of course, that wasn't helping at all. And I knew that John Lennon was in town. He was doing a bed-in. Remember the bed-ins?
Yes, absolutely. Bed-in for peace.
Yes, exactly, with Yoko. Now, I didn't know John Lennon. I'd never met him. And I thought, I need to talk to somebody, somebody I don't know, maybe who can give me another point of view on all this, because I'm going crazy here. So I leave the theatre. It was pouring with rain. I walked to the hotel, the Queen Elizabeth Hotel. I arrived looking like a drowned rat. And the concierge looked at me, Petula, comment ça? I said, I want to see John Lennon. Oh, yes, he's up there. And all. Oh, okay.
That wouldn't happen today.
No security whatsoever. Up I go. The door is open. I walk in, and there are John and Yoko in bed, in their 90s. Okay. And I was standing there, dripping water, and going, crying, sobbing. And John looks and he said, is that you, Petula? yes, come here, love, And so he gives me a big hug, and I think Yoko was a bit bemused by the whole thing. And he said, what's going on? And I told him the story. And I don't know if I can repeat this. You're a grown up, aren't you, Brian?
Yeah, at last sighting, yes.
So I said, I don't know what am I supposed to do, John? I don't know. And he said, you know what? Fuck 'em.
Mm-hmm.
And he said it with a Liverpool accent, of course. I said, oh, okay, yes. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for that advice, John, and I'll remember that. And he said, you know what, you need a drink? I said, a glass of wine might be nice. He said, you just go in the living room there. He was in a suite. So I go in there, and there were one or two people there. One of the Smothers Brothers was there, whom I knew. I think Timothy Leary was there. But there was no drugs going on, none at all. And I just gave me a glass of wine. And we were just sitting around, chilling out, really. There was this music going on in the background, and it's a very simple little melody. And yes. And then somebody came over with some lyric sheets. And look at this. And it was, we are saying, let's give peace a chance. And little did I know that all of this was being recorded. So I am on the record of Give Peace a Chance.
I've seen you on the video, and it's amazing. Well, they I don't know whether it was at the same time that they laid down the tracks, but there were quite a few cameras in the room because you can see it, and you're there.
I wasn't aware of that.
Oh yeah, there's a video of it, and so you became part of the iconic anthem for peace during the anti-Vietnam War movement, which is amazing. Just so for those who basically were so rude and inhospitable to you, they actually ended up doing you a bit of an unintentional favor because
Yes, but Brian, I've been back to Montreal many times since, and all of that stuff is over. I mean, it's
it was a raw moment. It was a very, very raw moment, and
yes, it was,
and it had parallels in places like Paris and in other parts of the world. But I think that time does tend to heal some of those wounds, and it's a little bit more relaxed, shall we say now.
Absolutely.
And people are a little more polite.
And I made a record in Montreal a few months back. All Quebec songwriters. It was wonderful. Wonderful,
right? That album's called VDC, which
I think so.
Everyone should go out and get a copy of, or just download it, stream it.
Great songwriters, great musicians, great producers. I had a fantastic time in Montreal.
Yeah. Now, I can't let it pass without mentioning another of the songs that you said wasn't one of your favorites, but it's notable, and that's This Is My Song, because it was written by Charlie Chaplin. And my understanding is that it was intended originally for his last movie, A Countess from Hong Kong, which I think is the one with Marlon Brando, but didn't end up there, and he was disappointed and was looking for someone to sing it. And, he was in Switzerland, you're in Switzerland by that point. How did it end up becoming a song for you?
It was a bit funny because you're right. Charlie was living in Switzerland and so was I, but I wasn't in Switzerland at the time. And somehow the music publisher in London got in touch with me and sent me a tape of this song. I was in Reno. I was working in Reno, nice little town, and this tape arrived, and it was a tape, like I get the 8-track or something like that. Yeah. And of course, we had no way, 4-track. Sorry, there was no way to listen to it, so we had to go to a radio station to have them play it to us, and it was a backing track, and I thought, oh, this is really awful, and I really don't like this,
Yeah.
And anyway, I thought that was it. And then Warner Brothers sent Ernie Freeman to Reno. Now, Ernie Freeman was one of the great orchestrators, arrangers at that time. He did That's Life with Sinatra. Anyway, I'd met him a couple of times. He arrives at the house that we were living in Reno, and knocks at the door, and he's standing there like this. He's drunk.
Uh-huh.
And I said, well, come in, Ernie. And our 2 daughters had never seen anybody drunk before, and they thought it was hilarious. They adored him. And we had a nanny there too, and of course, the whole thing was going, what am I doing here? Why are they sending Ernie Freeman, of all people, to do an orchestration of This Is My Song? This is almost like a psychedelic trip of some sort, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And I thought, and he was kind of like, and we were going over the song, and we went over the song many, many times during the day. And he eventually left at the end of the day, still drunk, despite all the black coffee that we poured into him.
Yeah.
Adorable. We got to Los Angeles, I think, a week later, walked into the studio. There he was, stone sober, conducting this fantastic orchestration for This Is My Song.
But you still don't like it?
Yeah. The nanny of our children, she said, oh, I love that song. I said, oh, really? Oh, yes, that's wonderful. And of course, why was Ernie Freeman drunk? He was terrified of flying.
Ah.
Yeah, and the only way they could get him on the plane was, that he had to get out of it. And I don't think our two daughters have ever forgotten that. But the first time I performed it live was on Hollywood Palace, which was in Hollywood.
Yep.
And oh God, I got to sing this live in front of an audience. Here we go. The place went insane. They absolutely adored it. And I said, what?
It turned into a #1 hit.
Of course. It was huge. And I met Charlie afterwards, and he was delighted. And I thought, what's going on here? I think, it was a rather syrupy, romantic song after all the great sort of more, I don't know, different kind of vibe songs that I'd been singing.
Yeah.
And I just didn't get it, But there you go. I didn't get it.
Well, I think that Charlie Chaplin had about 6 great songs, and Smile is obviously the greatest.
Yes.
And it's really sentimental, but it's sweet, and it's the thing that makes it work is that it's honest. That's the way he was. That's the way he felt.
That's very true. Yeah.
And I think that's probably true of This Is My Song. But obviously, you're moving in different circles, different times, and I can see how it wouldn't have struck you that way, and a lot of people, but it clearly landed for a lot of other people. I read, interestingly, about that song. You know how it is that you sometimes lose track of a performer that, has been kind of a staple, and you aren't aware that they've left the world? Well, apparently, I read that he really, really intended that song to be sung by Al Jolson.
Yes.
And that he literally did not know that Al Jolson had died 18 years earlier and had to be convinced of it.
I know, and they got somebody to take a photograph of Al Jolson's grave and sent it to Charlie to prove that Mr. Jolson had gone.
That's amazing. Well, moving to the opposite extreme, I mean, you also had an encounter along the way. I understand it was with Karen Carpenter, with the King himself, with Elvis. That was in Vegas, right?
Yes.
Tell us how that happened and what it was like.
Okay. Well, Karen and I, we're friends, and we were both in Vegas. I can't quite remember why we were both in Vegas. Maybe I just finished a date or something. Anyway, we met up, and we both had a night off, which is, kind of rare. So, well, why don't we just go out, And Elvis was in town at the Hilton Hotel. Neither of us had seen Elvis on stage, certainly hadn't met him, So, well, why don't we go and see him, So we go along, and of course we're treated like royalty. We're recognized, blah blah blah, and Elvis is told that we're in, and ladies and gentlemen, but Petula Clark and Karen Carpenter, that's a blah blah blah. Good, okay. And then after the show, he was very on form. I have to say, He was really, really on form. Mr. Presley would like you to go back to his dressing room. Okay. So we go. And Mr. Presley was in the inner dressing room getting his makeup off and getting changed,
Right.
And you know what the dressing rooms are like in Vegas. They're huge, and there was this sitting room, and there was a group of people who kind of talk out there, kind of from Nashville, and okay, a little group of people, obviously his people, and Karen and I are sitting there, and the door opens, and there he is. I mean, drop dead, gorgeous,
Mm-hmm.
Really, really, really handsome, and we're sort of looking at him like that, and he's looking at us, and he was obviously thrilled. Shall I say, obviously thrilled at seeing us?
I see.
And yes, and so, and he was absolutely charming, very much the Southern gentleman. I mean, no, nothing nasty going on at all.
Yeah.
And I noticed that the guys from Nashville had gone, so it was just Elvis, Karen, and me.
Yeah.
And so it was nice, and it was a great show and all the rest of it, and talking in general. And I can sense these things. Maybe it's just living in France for a while, and older than Karen, and I could sense where this was going. And I said to Karen, "Well, we better be going, Karen." She looked at me. I said, "Yes, so you've got that thing in the morning."
Yeah.
And nobody does anything in the morning in Vegas, so
of course.
Said, what thing? I said, that thing, that phone call that came through. So I get hold of her hand and pull her out.
Yeah.
And we get to the door. And I say, "Fantastic evening. Thank you so much, Elvis. It was just brilliant, really brilliant." And he looks at me. And he doesn't say anything, but he was saying, "I'll get you one day." He never did.
No.
Yeah. That was, and people have said to me, "Why didn't you just let it happen?"
Yeah.
We could have changed the history of pop music and a few other things. But yes. I felt responsible for Karen. She's younger than me.
Yeah. Well,
there you go.
Good on you. Bad for the king, sadly. But
I did meet him again afterwards, and he never forgot that. But
well,
he was not so on form.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about your theater career, which is a whole different chapter. And I know, of course, that you've been in and about the theater for a long time, but really as you start moving into big stage musicals, it's something fresh and new. And that kind of started with Sound of Music, right?
Yes. I didn't want to do Sound of Music on the stage. That belongs to somebody else. Let's face it. That other English person.
Yeah.
And I said, no. I had never seen the movie, and so I was off doing something out in the Middle East. I don't know what I was doing, and I bought the tape of Sound of Music and put it on in my hotel room, and it was wonderful. And of course, Julie was superb. It was just great. And I called London. I said, "No way, I can't do this." And they said, "Well, we'll talk about it when you get back." And I said, "Listen, I don't know why you're asking me to do this. I am so different to Julie. My voice is different. Everything about me is different,
Yeah.
They said, "Well, that's why we're asking you to do it." So I said, after a lot of humming and hawing, I said, "Okay." And so I did it. And it was very successful. It was very hard work.
Huge. 13 months on the West End. That is no small thing. Did you talk to Julie about it? Did you let her know that you were going to be doing it?
No,
No?
no. I talked to Mary Martin.
Yes.
In fact, it was written for Mary Martin. She did it originally.
Yeah.
And I met her and we got along very well. And of course, Mary's voice was more like mine.
Yeah.
Julie's up here somewhere.
Yeah.
Mary and I are here.
Right.
So everything had to be brought down, musically for my voice. It was a very tough show to do. Not only do you have to sing like crazy and then dance and all that stuff, but you have to carry those kids around.
Yes, and put up with them.
No, they were lovely. They were lovely, and they changed. Sometimes we would go out on stage and we see a totally different group of children.
Oh dear! Oh dear!
But it was great fun too.
Yeah, a huge critical success. Everyone thought you were great. Some people said the best Maria ever. And
she did. She did. The real Maria said that.
I mean, you can't ask for more validation for that. But then, next along comes Blood Brothers, and that's a really different kind of show. That's a tragic musical. And my understanding is that essentially the recasting of that show was it the American production, the Broadway production that was kind of heading for the rocks?
Yes, I mean, it opened on Broadway with mostly British cast, or the leads were British. Mm-hmm. The rest of the cast were American. Yes, it's what you might call a kitchen sink musical. It's not, there's no glamour, no beautiful costumes, none of that. And I had seen it in London, and Bill Kenwright, the producer, whom I liked very much, a friend, asked me to do it, and I thought, well, I'm not sure about this, He said, well, come to New York, see the New York production. So we flew out to New York, and I liked the New York production better. I thought the supporting cast were amazing, and I liked the idea of working with an American cast. So anyway, I was, as usual, going, I don't think so. Bill was getting really, really fed up with me. And we went to have a drink in a hotel on Times Square, just across the road from the theatre. And we were sitting there drinking, and I looked up at him and I said, I'll do it. He said, what? I said, I'll do it. And I was sort of like, oh.
Yeah.
And from there on, he got David Cassidy to play the son, Mickey, and then he got David's half-brother to play the other son,
Sean.
So suddenly it was really very, very special. And we turned it into a hit. Right. And it was great. It was a great experience.
My understanding was they were about to close the show, kick them out of the theater. So they were really at the moment of sink or swim, and you obviously turned it into a huge. I mean, there was an extended US tour. Yeah, you leapt in, and that was really astonishing. And you were a Scouser in that, right? You had to be a Liverpudlian.
Yes. Well, when I met up with David Cassidy, we met up in London. He arrived, and it was like talking to John Lennon. He had the accent absolutely down. I mean, it was brilliant. He had obviously been working very hard on it. And Bill Kenwright, the producer, who is also from Liverpool, he said to David, you can't do that. He said, the American audience
won't understand.
Will never understand a word if you do that.
Yeah.
So he had to really tone it down, but his accent was brilliant.
Well, that was incredible. And then, as if that hadn't been huge enough, on comes Sunset Boulevard. And that, I think, is the biggest of them all for you. You ended up running 2,500 performances as Norma Desmond, based on the original Billy Wilder film, a very unlikable and unsympathetic character, but you had to find a way in Andrew Lloyd Webber's production of making it someone that you could actually live with for that length of 6 years almost. How did you go about that?
How did I go about it?
Yeah.
Well, I got a call from Trevor Nunn, who is, brilliant.
Yes, yes.
And he said, come and see me. I want to do it. And I didn't know it was about Sunset Boulevard. Well, I had a good idea,
Yeah.
And so I go along to the really useful company's offices in London. And there's Trevor Nunn. It's just the two of us in this room. And I said, listen. I said, listen, Trev. No, I didn't say that. I'm not right for this. I'm not right for this. I've seen it in New York with Glenn Close.
Mm-hmm.
It's a magnificent production, but I didn't feel moved by it. I felt it was a cold, spectacular show. I'm not right for this. He said, yes, you are. I said, no, wait a minute. No, you don't understand. He said, yes, I understand. He said, I'm Trevor Nunn.
Yes.
I said, well, he said, you're a wonderful actress. Thank you very much. I said, you don't want to hear me sing? He said, good God, no. I said, well, what makes you think that I can do this?
Uh-huh.
What do you think I can bring to this role? And he said, you will bring humor and vulnerability.
Mm.
I thought, that's interesting. I guess this guy knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And I tell you, I left there. I had been saying no all afternoon. And he was saying yes all afternoon. And I left and I got in a taxi from Covent Garden, where the offices were, to Chelsea, where I was staying. And I had a really cute guy driving the taxi, a real skinhead, talk like that. Hello, Pet, how's it going? What? Like, I said, I've got a bit of a problem. He says, what's up, love? I said, well, I told him, I don't know what to do. I've got to make this decision, and I'm not sure about it. And it all came out, and he was, oh yeah, right, yeah. And then we got to Chelsea, and I paid him, and I said, so, what do you think? He said, oh yeah, do it. That was it.
Did you retain his services in the future? I mean, it sounds like a good counselor.
No, that was it. He was lovely, and I sometimes you just need to talk to somebody, and then
right,
and he was it.
And you found those elements in the role, so that you were able to actually approach Norma Desmond as a human rather than this kind of grotesque caricature, which she can be.
Yes, I mean, there are some people who thought that I wasn't grotesque enough, of course. I felt, that underneath all that harsh veneer, there was someone else, and
right.
she that's what I was searching for. And at the end of the American tour, because we took it on tour of the States, the last scene, that crazy scene when she's coming down the stairs and all the photographers are there because she's murdered somebody, but she thinks it's because she's back.
Right.
She's back as a star. And she says, I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille.
Yes.
She comes down and, I don't know if you remember the movie, but she's like kind of a gargoyle. I mean, she's really... Yeah. And by the time I'd been playing it for, 2 years, I thought, no, I'm going to do this differently. And I came down the stairs and I took her back to being 16 when she was a lovely young star.
Oh, wow.
And she says, I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille. Whoa!
Yeah.
I like that. But, I think people were sort of expecting, the big finish.
The glorious Swanson. But,
yes.
I think that, that already exists, so why not take it in a different direction? I mean, if a piece has
Yeah,
depth and it's open to different interpretations, it has to be able to live
yeah.
in different ways. So good
Because,
on you
the
for that.
famous Max, when he was talking about her as the great star, he said, you can't imagine how lovely she was, this great, lovely young star. We never see her like that.
Yeah,
And I thought that was the ideal moment for her to come back.
like that. Exactly like
A
that.
moment of
Yeah,
madness, yes.
exactly. Now, you also did Shaw's Candida along the way, which is, a purely non-musical part, and you created a musical. Unfortunately, that didn't end up terribly well for reasons that had
Yeah,
nothing to do with your music. But that one was called Someone Like You, and a very interesting premise, but hard to get a chance to hear the music, unfortunately, because it was a difficult production. That must have been a terrible disappointment.
it was a huge disappointment. It started off as something totally different, and somewhere along the line, we lost it.
Uh-huh.
And I learned something from that. You have to listen to other people's advice, opinions, but in the end, you have to stick with what you believe in. And I didn't. I
Right.
lost it. I thought everybody knew better than me, and the show just drifted away, disappeared. There are people who saw it because the whole thing takes place during the Reconstruction after the American Civil War.
Yeah.
And most people in England don't know about the Reconstruction. They don't know what that is. I think
Right.
they thought they were going to see Gone with the Wind or something like that.
Right.
I've spoken to quite a lot of Americans who did see it in London, and they loved it, but they understood it. So
Right.
I think, for whatever reason, it just didn't work.
Well, that's a pity, but hopefully, because the music still exists and your songs still exist, someone might take another try at it in the future and restore what it was meant to be. It would be, I think,
Yes.
really, really lovely if that could happen.
It's difficult, Brian, going back to
Yeah.
something, particularly if it finished in a painful way.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I could put myself through that.
I can understand that. Well, there are wounds along the way for sure. But I did want to, and this is sort of in finishing us up, we are, after all, the Gould Foundation. This is the Gould Standard. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about, another of your celebrated admirers, Mr. Glenn Gould, who was so inspired that he actually created it. It's actually the first of his major radio documentaries. It's really almost a radio play called The Search for Petula Clark. And I think you've heard it. He's driving along the shore of Lake Simcoe between small towns, trying to scan the local radio stations as they drift in and out to find your singing. And my interpretation, even though he actually throws a few slightly snide but not really nasty jabs at you,
I know.
I think that he was totally crushing on you, and that's my reading of it. And somehow, his sense of self-respect made him feel the need to sort of, I'm not totally into pop music. I'm doing this other thing. So I don't think that was really intended to be personal. From people I know who knew him, he was just like over the moon for you. So,
Wow.
so I hope those little asides in the piece didn't wound you, but they needn't have, because I think he was a total fanboy.
Well, I don't know what to say. I was totally amazed by the whole thing. I mean,
Uh-huh.
Glenn Gould, likes me. I was a total fan of Glenn Gould, and I had always enjoyed classical music
Uh-huh.
right from the start. Always, I like music in general, and listening to him playing the piano, I was fascinated, obviously, by his amazing technique. And the thing about technique is it's very important, you know, to be able to play that stuff, physically to play it.
Yes.
But there was something else going on too. I don't think I was imagining it. I would have loved to have met him and spent some time with him, chatting, and possibly him playing piano while I sang.
Yes.
That would have been fun.
He totally would have done that. It might have to have been, Schoenberg's Bretel Lieder or something like that. But you actually told me that you like Schoenberg, so I don't know whether you were pulling my leg. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
So how did you encounter Arnold Schoenberg's music?
I saw, was it Wozzeck?
Oh yeah.
At the Royal Opera House in London, and was blown away by it.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a wonderful television station here in Geneva called Mezzo, where you can hear the most amazing music night after night after night. And you know, there's Richard Strauss, and I mean it's everything that I love. And every night not until about 3 or 4 a.m., may I say, I hear this amazing music. It's important for me to listen to great music. It seems to feed me in yes, of course, spiritually, and of course my ears love it, but my heart loves it too. It's music is deeply important to me. I would have loved to have met Glenn Gould. I think we would have gone on.
Well, believe me, if he had known that you were a lover of Schoenberg and Richard Strauss, who were, two of his favorite composers after Bach, he would have been an even greater fanboy. That would have been, I think, very meaningful to him. And it actually is very meaningful to us at the Glenn Gould Foundation because, out of the immense generosity of your heart, you came to Toronto and were on our 11th jury for the Glenn Gould Prize, which we give every second year. And that jury, of which you were a part, chose Philip Glass. And then with even greater generosity, you came and you were the Master of Ceremonies at the award ceremony a year later in Ottawa at the National Arts Centre. And I'm still not sure how I did it, but I persuaded you to learn one of Philip's songs and sing it right to his face.
Yes. Hey, that was scary, Brian.
You told me you were scared, and I was backstage with you, and I said, they're going to love you, and I'm sorry, but I was right. They adored you, but more to the point, Philip was overwhelmed. He just was so moved to hear you sing Streets of Berlin, which is actually a song that he wrote for Mick Jagger in the movie Bent.
Yes.
But you were great in it. I mean, it has a real sort of Brecht-Weill cabaret feeling, and you were totally on top of it.
Well, just about. And then Philip said to me at one point afterwards, he says, "Why don't you do that in your program, in your shows?" And I thought, I'll have to think about that.
Well, look, in an earlier life, I was an A&R guy. And if you ever want to do the classical album, just like Barbra Streisand did Classical Barbara,
Yes.
you come to me. We'll pick a program that will be absolutely boffo for you.
Oh, Brian, that sounds very tempting.
Well, if you're up to it, I might be up to it. But,
okay. Watch this space, right?
Yes. I also do have to mention, because, I finished up with the Glenn Gould Prize jury for a reason, which is that we've just announced our next prize jury, and the jury is going to be meeting, but entirely online because, of course, we are in the middle of a pandemic. And I couldn't be more excited. Our jury chair is Laurie Anderson, and we will have just an unbelievable roster. I won't name them all because it's a big jury, But for those who are curious, visit our website and find out. But the most important thing is that this time, when we make the announcement, we're going to be live streaming it to the world. We're going to have a media conference. And so if you visit our website, we'll post when we have all the tech details worked out. And you can find out at the moment that it's revealed who the next prize winner is. As you know, our last one was Jesse Norman, who was amazing.
Yes.
And
Yes. Wonderful.
But I have to say, on a personal note, like the great moment of my life, I mean, I've had a few, but certainly one of them was at our announcement of Philip, you coming out on stage and singing Downtown for the other jurors, getting them to chime in and sing along. That was
yes.
incredible.
Oh, yes, I remember that now. Oh, dear, what a cheek.
Not a cheek. It was absolutely, I mean, honestly, you made it for so many people doing that. So I just want
to... It's a wonderful memory, Brian.
Well, you will always be part of the Gouldosphere, a very precious part, but also very, very, very present in our hearts. I understand that you were, just to sort of bring us up to present, because we're all still a little bit locked in because of the pandemic. You were going to be in a production of Mary Poppins, weren't you, before it all hit?
I was in a brand new, amazing production of Mary Poppins. We opened in November last year, and we closed on the 17th of March.
Oh.
When everything locked down. It was an amazing, first of all, the production is amazing. I don't play Mary Poppins, folks. I play the bird lady, feed the birds.
Yes.
And yes. And I remember that we were about to do a matinee on a Sunday. I was doing my makeup, and there was a knock on the door. Would you come down to the stage, Miss Clark? And I thought, this doesn't sound good.
Uh-oh.
And of course, that's where it was announced that we were closing, and have been closed ever since. And the West End is closed, and that's really bad news.
Yeah, it's awful. And of course, the worst of it is we just don't know how much longer it's going to last. Let's hope they get a good, reliable, non-politically motivated vaccine that really helped to bring this chapter in human history to a close. But are you working on it? Are you writing songs now, or preparing for a new album, or anything that's
not really. You would think that with all this sort of free time that I would be doing that, but I've been cooking for my husband.
That's lovely.
Which is something new for me, and I've been doing that. There's also an album that's just gone out. Actually, it's the Royal Albert Hall album that I did in 1974. It's actually not bad at all. I'm very rarely pleased with what I do, but this was an amazing evening, and it's just gone out.
We'll post a link.
Also, my husband is in a clinic here. He had a hip operation, so I'm going there every day. I'm being a nice little housewife. That's what I'm being.
Oh, all right. Well, let's us get together. We'll talk about that classical album. Let's see if we can't make that happen.
Yeah. Okay. Meanwhile, the Royal Albert Hall album has got some pretty good stuff on it. I'm quite proud of it.
We will post a link, and folks, this is a great time for you to all sort of go through your record collections and get your copies of Petula's albums, and remember how absolutely wonderful they are. Find the cast albums, and dig out a copy of I Know Where I'm Going, shall we? And be thankful, because I didn't say how many years at the start, because I felt it was going to be rude, but it's an 80-year career. That's pretty incredible.
Yes.
Yes. And look at you. You're amazing. You're
Fortunately, I can't see myself.
No, you're fantastic, Petula. Honestly, we are so grateful. I'm going to let you. You've been beyond generous. In fact, I've taken up 2.5 times as much time as I said. So the fact that you didn't flip me the bird and say I'm out of here is a testament to just how lovely and warm and generous you are. I'll sign off now, but I wanted to say in conclusion that this is the Gould Standard. It is the podcast of the Glenn Gould Foundation. Please like, share, and subscribe. Tell your friends. We want lots and lots of people to see this and our upcoming conversations. Visit the website of the Glenn Gould Foundation, www.glenngould.ca. Come tune in on October 15th at noon Eastern Time when we announce the next Glenn Gould Prize winner. And if you can find it in your heart in these difficult times to support the work of the Glenn Gould Foundation, we do rely on the generosity of arts lovers, admirers of Glenn Gould, possibly admirers of Petula Clark, to help us keep doing our work. So if you would visit our website, you'll see how to make a gift, and we would be ever so grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Petula.
Thank you, Brian.